We're in Dante's circle of the heretics. And as I mentioned last time, we think of heresy as a rejection of Christian teaching. And there are hints in this canto that the two figures that we come across, a guy named Farinata and a guy named Cavalcante, they do in fact do this. They do reject Christian teaching. But that's not the subject of discussion at all. The subjects of discussion turn out to be politics first and then poetry second. And this all raises the question of what's Dante getting at? What's the bigger point he's trying to make about heresy? I think the question he's trying to raise is what is heresy? I mean, what is it really? And second, why is it bad? What is the harm that it does to take, let's say, a point of view that's different from the official teaching of the church? Now, here's Dante in the circle of the heretics. There are flaming tombs, and Dante is taken in by the glare and doesn't see that a guy has popped out of a tomb, a very majestic figure who's sort of almost, you could say, posing for his own statue. And Dante describes him as someone who is, quote, proclaiming his disdain for hell. That's his manner. It's aristocratic, it's majestic, it's even, Dante uses this term, a little contemptuous. And now we're going to do a close reading of what happens in this canto. This is the figure speaking to Dante, having come out of this flaming tomb. O Tuscan, walking through our flaming city alive, and speaking with such elegance, be kind enough to stop here for a while. So this is the guy, turns out to be this fellow named Farinata, speaking to Dante. And he continues, your mode of speech identifies you clearly as one whose birthplace is that noble city, with which in my time perhaps I was too harsh. Now, what's happening here? You've got Dante in a remote place, and this guy recognizes him. O Tuscan is a way of saying you are a fellow from Tuscany. Tuscany is the area encompassing Florence, also encompassing places like Pisa. It's that region of Italy. So this is a guy who's from that region himself, in fact, a fellow Florentine. He recognizes Dante. He goes, hey, Dante. And then he says your mode of speech. So he's kind of saying your way of talking, i.e. your accent, identifies you as a Florentine, as a member of that birthplace, of that noble city. And then he goes, with which in my time perhaps I was too harsh. Now we'll come back to that part of it for a moment. But Dante is taken aback, and he turns away. He turns to Virgil, and Virgil says, turn around and look at Farinata, who has risen. You will see him from the waist up standing straight. So Virgil is telling Dante, here's a guy that you need to talk to, presumably because he's got something that Dante needs to hear and needs to think about. And then Virgil says this, be sure you choose your words with care. So think about what you're going to say, because this is a guy who's going to draw you into a conversation. And it turns out that this figure, Farinata, is a very commanding presence, and right away he seizes the verbal initiative from Dante in this way. This is Dante. And when I reached the margin of his tomb, he looked at me and half contemptuously he asked, and who would your ancestors be? Now, this is a very interesting question. And it's a very odd question for someone to ask, right? Because, first of all, picture the scene. Flaming tombs, a man pops out. He recognizes Dante as sort of someone from the old neighborhood. It's kind of like if you or I are in a remote place and we see another guy, another American, he goes, hey, you from America? Yeah, I am too. So you think that the first thing he would say would be, he would talk about what he has in common with Dante. But no, he actually asks a very pointed and kind of sarcastic question, which has a presumed answer. And who would your ancestors be? The idea is your ancestors are probably not as good as mine, are they? In other words, I am from the aristocratic class, and quite evidently from your manner and your way of speech, you're not. And then, we're continuing now, Dante says, quote, he lifted up his brows a little. So think of how beautifully Dante paints a picture here. Here's this guy standing majestically, posing in a sense for his own photograph or his own statue. And he puts his eyebrows up. And here's what he says. Bitter enemies of mine they were, and of my ancestors, and of my party. I had to scatter them not once but twice. Bitter enemies of mine they were. Who's they? Dante's ancestors. So without Dante even answering, Farinata is saying, your ancestors were bitter enemies of my ancestors. They're enemies of my family and of my party. Now, in Italy at the time, family and party kind of went together. And what I mean is that, by and large, in the factionalism of Italy, you had the Guelphs, you had the Ghibellines. This was the party of the papacy or the party of the empire. But remember, when I say party of the papacy, I don't mean that the ordinary Guelph would sit around worrying theologically about the papacy. It's more like two gangs who are fighting and they're looking for help from the outside. And if one can get it from the papacy, okay, they're the party of the papacy. And if one can get it from the empire, okay, they're the party of the empire. They're just looking for outside forces to help them to win the local battle so that they can rule Florence. And Farinata, it turns out, is a Ghibelline. He's a member of the rival party to Dante. And the Ghibellines were a minority in Florence. The Guelphs, Dante's party, was the majority. And what does Farinata mean when he says, I had to scatter them not once, but twice? I'll tell you in just a moment, but let's keep going. Dante, taken aback by this idea that his ancestors were thrown out, replies like this. He says, they were expelled, but only to return from everywhere, not once but twice, an art your men, however, never mastered. Okay, so what you have here is a kind of a kind of back and forth debate, a kind of jibe, in which Farinata is saying to Dante, you know what, your ancestors are not as good as mine. And by the way, my ancestors and I kicked your ancestors out twice out of Florence. And Dante goes, well, yeah, but you know what? My ancestors came back and yours didn't. So you have Dante trying to kind of one-up Farinata. And what they're talking about is a battle that I will get to next time. It's a famous battle called the Battle of Monteperti. And this is a battle in which the Ghibellines allied with the outside nation of Siena. So the Ghibellines were a minority in Florence. They couldn't beat the Guelphs on their own. So they go to the Sienese and they team up with the Sienese army and then they invade Florence, defeat the Guelphs on two occasions. First in 1248, then in 1260. 1260 is the Battle of Monteperti. And Dante is born the next year in 1261. And so what Farinata is appealing to is the history of Dante's youth and pointing out that his ancestors came out on top and Dante's were kicked out. And Dante says to Farinata, but yes, you know what? After you died, my ancestors came back. The Guelphs returned. They were able to reestablish themselves in power after the Battle of Monteperti, even though they lost. And then the Ghibellines were never able really to return. It was a permanent defeat for the Ghibellines. They became a party of exiles. And so Dante is going to say, we won in the end. We learned the art of coming back, and your party never did. But you notice what's happening here is that Dante is in a sense falling into Farinata's trap. He's playing the same game as Farinata, and think about where it got Farinata. He's in hell. So the lesson that Dante apparently needs to learn and isn't learning is that this kind of bitter factional warfare that brings everybody down in the end is not a good thing for society. And we want to think about what this kind of factional infighting, what resemblance it bears to heresy. Think of what heresy does. It splits the church. It breaks Christianity into rival pieces that then go to war with each other. It really ends up with a much weaker Christianity in the end. So we're beginning to get here, even in the beginning of this conversation with Farinata, which goes on and will go on with it, is a little hint that heresy is more than just, I don't accept a doctrine. It is ultimately about taking the truths of Christianity themselves and splintering them into internecine, viciously fighting rival factions.